Good afternoon. This afternoon we have Professor James Robinson. He is a David Florence Professor of Government at Harvard University and Faculty Associate at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. His main research, as everybody will know, his research interests are in comparative economics and political development with focus on a long run with particular interest in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. We agree that he will talk for 45 minutes, so we have a few minutes for question and answers. Thank you.
Okay. If I talk loudly, can everyone hear me? Because I'm not very good at talking and sitting at the same time. No? Hopeless? No. I feel like a rock star if I hold it. if I hold this like this, maybe I can take it out. Oh yes, okay. I feel like Barry Manilow. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And so today I was going to talk about, try and talk about something serious. Nowadays I seem to be talking mostly about this book that Daron and I have, which some people regard as not terribly serious. We regard it as serious, but anyway, I thought for such a sophisticated audience, something a little bit more high octane was required. So I'm going to talk about some research which is very new, and ongoing with Daron and Camilo Garcia Jimeno, who's an assistant professor in the economics department at UPenn. And it's about, the big question we're interested in is sort of trying to conceptualize and kind of measure empirically the impact of the state and state capacity on economic development. So I can give a sort of big introduction for 5 minutes, and then I'll delve into the details of this paper, which is much more kind of specific and technical. But I guess I don't quite know when economists got interested in this topic. Political scientists and sociologists have been interested in it for a long time, this idea that states have different characteristics and different capacities and different abilities and vary enormously in their efficiency and their competence to undertake different things, different policies, raise taxes, provide order, etc. But it seems to me that the economists really got interested in this question at the time of this so-called Asian miracle, that when in the 1990s people started trying to figure out why on earth was it that South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore had been so successful economically. Most people agreed, not economists, this was mostly sociologists, political scientists, Robert Wade, Alice Amsden, Chalmers Johnson. They sort of agreed that the state had played this enormously powerful role in creating incentives and organizing the industrialization. At the same time, for every case where states have done that successfully, there's at least another 5 cases where states have tried to do that and they failed miserably. So it's clear that in some sense, if some states may have capacity to do things, other states don't have capacity to do things. And I think it's only in the last few years that economists have started trying to think about these issues theoretically, empirically, and try to get a handle on what creates variation across country and state capacity. What is state capacity? How do you measure that? State capacity, I have the word here, we have the word in the title. State capacity is a very multifaceted thing. Sociologists are obsessed with sort of what they call the Weberian state, with a lot of bureaucratic capacity. Economists Tim Besley and Thorsten Pearson, in their book Pillars of Prosperity, look a lot at fiscal capacity, so the decision to build fiscal system, raise taxes, introduce income taxes, avoid tax avoidance. But that's not the only thing. You could just think about basic things as providing order and security in society. So Max Weber, of course, the great sociologist of the state, said, when he defined the state, he said, the state is the entity which exercises the legitimate monopoly of violence in society. So Weber started with something much more basic than either public good provision or taxation, which was sort of order and who has the weapons. And if you thought about states in the world, whether it be Colombia or Mexico or the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Sudan or Pakistan or wherever it is, most of those states don't exercise the monopoly of violence. I don't know about legitimacy. I'm not going to have much to say about legitimacy. My friend Stephen Morris, who's a game theorist. Probably some of you in this room know him. Every year, Stephen sends me an email saying, so what's the latest thinking in political science on legitimacy? And I said, well, exactly what it was last year when you asked me, which is no one has a handle on what legitimacy means. So I won't talk about the legitimate monopoly of violence. And I'm actually not even going to show you regressions with violence today, even though when I get into that, you'll see that that's very much part of the agenda. Okay, so what this research is about is sort of trying to think about a model of development of state capacity thought of in a very simple way, and a simple way which is just going to be, we're going to operationalize capacity along the lines, you could say, you know, Michael Mann, who's a famous sociologist at UCLA, who's written a vast 4-volume treatise on state capacity, he talks about what's called infrastructural power, and what we're going to mean by capacity in this research is really just the presence of the state, the physical presence of state agencies and state employees. So you're going to say that's kind of hopelessly simplistic. What about the total factor productivity of the state and everything else? And I'm going to agree with you, but this is just where we are at the moment. But in the context we're going to look at, so I'm going to talk about the model, but we're going to be interested in estimating the model. And the empirical context is going to be in Colombia. And this is going to be particularly interesting in the Colombian case. About at least 10 years ago, there were no police stations in about 250 municipalities in Colombia. Now, today there's a police station in every municipality, but I talked about this recently to Antonio Navarro, who's a distinguished Colombian politician, and I said this fact to him, and he said, yes, that's true. Now there's 250 police stations with police who are too scared to go out of the front door. So there's massive variation in state capacity, no matter how conceptualized in Colombia, including in this simple way of the presence of the state. And there's huge variation in development outcomes within Colombia as well. So I'm going to talk about the model in a bit and the conceptual framework we took. But why are we interested in looking at Colombia? Well, I guess we want to do something empirical, and we've thought a lot about doing this at a cross-national level, and then we gave up. We couldn't find a good approach at a cross-national level. So we've been focusing on within country variation in state capacity and within country variation in development outcomes, because it seems there's just such a huge amount of variation at that level, and there's much more chance of having some kind of identification or some more convincing estimates of the consequences of state capacity for development. There's going to be a lot of focus here on internal validity, you know, what the external validity of anything this is in the different contexts. I'm not going to have anything very definitive or convincing to say, but you know, this is the way it goes in economics, right? So we're going to think about, I'm going to think about a simple model of the development of state capacity measured in this way in terms of just the physical presence of state agencies and public employees. And the reason I start talking immediately about the empirical context in Colombia is that we want to think about state capacity both chosen at the national level, but also chosen at the local level. So it seems to us, in thinking about the Colombian case, but thinking about other cases, that you need to think simultaneously about the choice of state capacity at a local level as well as the national level. So, for example, you know, if you were interested in the United States, it would be impossible to think about the decision to develop state capacity in the United States without thinking at the local level, because the federal and even below federal level is so important. If you look in the 19th century, for example, when the US, you know, despite this enormously complicated context, created this very powerful, effective state throughout the whole United States. That was as much local institutions doing that as it was national institutions. After all, there was no income tax in the United States in the 19th century. So the federal government had to come up with low-budget, clever ways of solving problems, like getting railways built, but it also involved a lot of local initiative and local decision-making too. So when we thought about this, trying to think about, let's tackle this at the subnational level, there's more chance of being able to say something kind of incisive from a point of view of identification, Then we started thinking very much about local decisions. And when we started thinking about local decisions, we started thinking about interaction between local decisions. So that's going to create a lot of kind of econometric issues. But to us, it's made us think a lot sort of theoretically about how this process kind of works. And I hope that for those of you who are interested in this topic, you'll see that there's a lot of new stuff kind of comes into this when you start thinking about it in this way. So I'm just kind of jumping over this. I think Daron wrote these slides, so I didn't really approve. He deleted the bits I liked. So I won't talk endlessly about the literature. There's lots of very interesting work on this topic, but I think I'm safe to say that there's no well-identified empirical paper on this topic. So, okay. So given this motivation about the local presence of the state, okay, then it seems important to try to think about how this interacts. Think about the Colombian context and think about them, creating a monopoly of violence. I always think of, I guess he's not here, but I think about this paper by Ernesto Shadgrodzki and Rafael Di Tella about the crime in Buenos Aires, that they had this natural experiment in policing where this synagogue was blown up and there was this huge increase in policing in this one sort of barrio in Buenos Aires. And then what they showed was that the crime went down like mad in that barrio, and it shifted to the barrios alongside where the police were poured in. So you can see that developing state capacity in one municipality can create enormous externalities for other municipalities. If one municipality in Colombia invests in, fighting the guerrilla, then the guerrilla just move to the next municipality. So it seems once you start thinking in this local way, you need to really start thinking about the strategic interactions between municipalities in terms of making decisions about state capacity. So we're going to try to think of we're going to develop a model of state capacity as a sort of network in some sense. You can think of the municipalities in Colombia as forming a network, and one municipality is surrounded by other municipalities, and you can think of those as being kind of linked together in some sense in a kind of fixed network. And we're going to use that to think about how the state capacity in one municipality is going to depend on the state capacity of all the surrounding municipalities, kind of for the intuition I gave you. I don't think you want to think about this just necessarily in a technological way. You could also think of it in a political way. It could be that if the mayor in the municipality next to me starts providing public goods and starts doing things that people like, then that's going to put pressure on me. I'm the mayor of the neighboring municipality. That's going to put pressure on me to start providing public goods and doing things that people like. So I don't think this is necessarily a kind of technological relationship. It could be a political relationship. It could be all sorts of things. We're going to model it in a pretty reduced form way, as you're going to see in a minute. But it just seems kind of intuitively to us that these interactions have to be important, so we want to try to take that seriously. So we're going to model these kind of social interactions in a network, and we're going to be thinking about the effect of state presence on prosperity in a particular municipality measured in a bunch of different ways. I'll explain in a minute. We're going to think about how that spills over onto neighboring municipalities. And we're also going to think about the role of the national state here. So that being said, we don't have any econometric estimates for the national state. So I'm going to set the model up in a general way, but I'm just going to talk about a special case today where the national state kind of drops out, for which we have results. So let me not offer too much, but that's kind of on the agenda to try to think about the relationship between the national state and the local state. Okay, and just thinking about these interactions is going to generate a lot of sort of complicated stuff that I'm certainly a novice at. So I've never Daron and I actually never wrote a paper with structural econometrics in anymore. We never wrote a paper with structural econometrics in the past, and so I don't want to go overboard on how great structural econometrics is. Probably some of you in the room are convinced already, but I think if I start getting it's like the zealous, I don't want to be zealous like the newly converted, because if I do that, I risk throwing away 15 years of hard empirical work with non-structural models. So I'm sort of, I'll try to be pragmatic about this rather than, zealous, okay? But so the first slide is a kind of more zealous thing, which sort of says, once you start writing a model down and, solving for the Nash equilibrium and plugging it back into this and that, you see that doing a naive regression isn't actually going to identify the coefficient you're interested in, and I can illustrate that when we get to the analysis later. Okay? We're going to be, interested in these sort of spillover effects because it's, one thing that's particularly interesting here is whether or not, if I'm thinking about a game where municipalities are choosing their level of state capacity kind of simultaneously, is this strategic? Is it a world of strategic complements or is it a world of strategic substitutes? So that's something that the regressions can tell us about. We're going to estimate the parameter that's going to tell us whether or not what you have is strategic complements or strategic substitutes. But that's a kind of really interesting thing to think about. But we're also very worried, and I'll talk more about this when I get to talking about how the identification is going to work here. We're also worried a lot about, I guess, what I'm going to call correlated shocks affecting neighboring groups of localities together. And this will make more sense when I talk about the identification. We're going to use a particular identification strategy which is due to Jan Bramoulle and Rachel Cranton and their collaborators, but it doesn't work very well in this context. So we're going to use a kind of historical approach to try to solve the problems that their approach throws up in this context, but probably that's going to be much easier to see when I talk about the econometrics. And of course, we're going to have a classic kind of reflection problem here, a la Mansky, which we're going to have to solve by exploiting the neighborhood structure, and this is where the approach by Bramoulle and Cranton, etc., is going to come in. Okay, so as I said, I think Colombia is a kind of very interesting context to think about. There's massive variation in the capacity of the state. There's massive variation in development outcomes as well. In Colombia, you go all the way from a municipality like Sopó, which is just north of Bogota, where supposedly nobody is below the poverty line, to municipalities in the Pacific or Caribbean coast, where, like Quibdó, where more than 95% of people might be below the poverty line. So there's vast variation in any kind of development outcome you want to look at, and there's vast variation in state presence. What are the kind of results that we get? Well, there's different ways of expressing the quantitative effects of this, because here, in some sense, if you think about it, we have 1,000 and 1,100 municipalities. There's all these kind of interactions. So my state capacity is going to affect take a development outcome, like proportion of the people in the municipality below the poverty line. That's going to depend on my state capacity, but it's going to depend on my neighbor's state capacity as well, in a way I'm going to specify in a minute. And so this creates all of these interactions, both with respect to these development outcomes, but also with respect to these choices. So there's different kind of exercises you could do to sort of look at the comparative statics. You could do a kind of partial equilibrium exercise and say, if I increase the state capacity in one municipality, holding everything else constant, what's going to happen? Well, even if I increase my state capacity in my own municipality, that's going to affect my development outcomes. It's going to affect the development outcomes of my neighbors as well, because my state capacity spills over onto their prosperity as well. But that's a sort of partial equilibrium effect, because a general equilibrium effect would be, once I change my state capacity, it's not just that I affect my own and my neighbor's development outcomes, but then all my neighbors are going to re-optimize. So they're going to be, once I change my state capacity, they're going to optimally want to change their state capacity as well, and that's going to increase their prosperity. So if you thought hypothetically that state capacity was strategic complements, then if I increase my state capacity, that's going to tend to increase the state capacity of all the municipalities surrounding me. So there's going to be important general equilibrium effects on prosperity levels. Okay, so I'll do a whole bunch of quantitative exercises later on to kind of show this in more detail. But one thing that's kind of important is, so this is just to think of, for example, if you thought of an increase in 1/4 of a standard deviation in the number of state agencies in your own municipality, what does that do? Well, it induces a 1 percentage point reduction in your own population below the poverty line, and it induces a 0.1% reduction in population below the poverty line in your neighbors, say. Okay? So there's a kind of order of magnitude difference in terms of the own effect and the spillover effect, and I'll show that later in the regressions. But as I'm also going to show, the general equilibrium effects are very large. So once you take into account the general equilibrium effects, then the quantitative impact on development outcome is kind of really magnified. So I guess, you could think that's one justification for trying to use this approach, that it seems like, at least conditional on the model and the empirical approach, these general equilibrium effects look quantitatively very large. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, let me skip the colonial background. I'm going to come to that when I talk about the identification strategy, because I think that's going to be easier. That's a royal road. I'll come back to where the royal roads come in. Okay, all right. So let me talk a little bit about the model, otherwise I'm going to run out of time. So think of the municipalities in Colombia as a kind of network, and each municipality on average is bordered by 5 other municipalities. Okay, and we're going to think of, as I said, municipalities at the national level choosing it as a state capacity, although I'm not going to talk much about the national level here at all. And the payoff functions are going to be very reduced form. So there's hardly any politics in this paper, which is another kind of very odd thing for Daron and I to be doing. But you'll have to be. We haven't got there yet, so it's taken quite a time to kind of get this moving. And I think we're not where we want to be eventually, but you have to start somewhere. So I'll show the payoff functions. Okay, so we're going to represent this network matrix N of delta, which is going to capture in some sense the links between different municipalities, and we're going to allow one link is not the same as another link. Okay, so for example, we're going to introduce these weights, and the weights depend on distance between municipality I and municipality J. So centroids of some municipalities are much further apart. If you went to eastern Colombia in the Llanos or whatever, or south of Colombia, the municipalities are much larger. The centers are much more distant from each other. So we're going to take that into account. And since the topography in Colombia is often blamed for causing all its problems, we're going to measure in a simple way. This is just variability of altitude along this geodesic. So the idea here is that, if distance is greater or this variability of altitude is greater, then this thing is going to be smaller. So then there's going to be a lesser effect of your state capacity on my prosperity outcomes or on my own decisions. Okay, so just a simple way of kind of introducing weights in between this along these in this network. Okay, so we're going to posit the following kind of relationship between state capacity and prosperity. So PJI is some prosperity outcome J in municipality I. So that's going to be a bunch of things like secondary school enrollment, poverty, connection, utility connections, so proportion of the population that have connection to sewage or water or electricity, okay? And that's going to depend on SI, which is your own state capacity. It's going to depend on what is this thing, NI delta of S? This is like the weighted sum of your neighbor's state capacity. So this is a kind of interaction term which captures, how these state capacity of your neighbors and your own state capacity interact, and then we're going to allow for a direct effect of neighbor state capacity in a way which depends on what prosperity outcome J you're talking about. Okay? So how is state capacity produced? Well, in general, we're going to say, we're going to measure SI by, as I said, 2 different ways, just the number of public employees and the number of agencies. But here, we're going to be careful to distinguish between stuff that local authorities like the mayor controls and stuff that the national government controls. So police and army are controlled by the national government. So actually, we're not, despite my police station example, we're not using police stations as an example of the presence of the state, because that's really something a national state controls. So in all the regressions I'm going to show you today, we're just going to look at stuff that we're sure that local state authorities control. And in general, we're going to say state capacity depends on local inputs, LI, and national inputs, BI. But I'm going to look at a special case where basically the alpha equals 1. So this BI is just going to drop out, and I can do everything without talking about the national state as if it didn't matter just think about it. It doesn't matter for the decisions I'm going to look at. Okay, so this is, so this is what I mean by this is a pretty reduced form relationship. It might be capturing all sorts of things. It might be capturing here in this intercept, for example, total factor productivity. It could be that if you're in a municipality with very corrupt clientelistic politics, then having 1,000 public employees is something very different from having 1,000 public employees in a municipality with much less corrupt or less clientelistic politics. So that's just going to come out here, you could think of, in this intercept here. But I would say, and one of the things you might think is going to be surprising about this is, so some people's reaction, like Fred Feinen's reaction to this project was, oh, in Brazil, this is going to be negative. It's like public employees, they're just complete, it's just pure clientelism, it's just dead waste, more public sector employees, worse development outcomes. So that's not what we find at all here. And before you get into that skeptical frame of mind, you might also know, if you're not Colombian, that Colombia has like the smallest state in Latin America. So for example, civil servants as a percentage of population in Colombia is significantly lower than any other Latin American country. So it has a very, very small state. So you could say, well, the Colombians are on the upward sloping part of the Laffer curve or something like that. Maybe the Brazilians are, Fred is cynical because he studies Brazil. So maybe the Brazilians are on the downward sloping bit, but the Colombian state is so small that having a few people around would actually provide more public goods. So that's maybe a kind of piece of context that's worth thinking about. Okay, so here's the payoff functions. What's going to happen in municipality I is that municipality I, taking as given the state capacity decisions of all the other municipalities, is going to maximize this payoff function here. So theta is just this cost parameter. And the national state, when we get to it in a future iteration, is going to maximize this thing, meaning a weighted sum of the payoffs of the municipalities. There's going to be some own cost function for producing state capacity. And you could say, the politics are in these parameters here. So, but anyway, since I'm not going to show you results on that, I won't dwell on it. So, I'm not going to pretend there's politics here, because really there isn't. Okay, so there's just two. So just back up a second here. So what are they maximizing? They're maximizing prosperity minus the cost of providing state capacity. Okay, so that means, leaving aside the national state, we can think about what the Nash equilibrium in state capacity choice looks like for the municipalities. And we can derive a sort of first-order condition like this. Okay, so this is just the first-order condition for municipality I choosing SI, taking as given state capacity in other municipalities. And this is actually going to, we can look at this. In fact, this parameter C1 here is going to determine whether or not, which we're going to estimate, is going to determine whether or not you have strategic substitutes or strategic complements. Okay. So we can solving this, we can write SI as a kind of linear function of the, remember this term here is sort of like the weighted average of the state capacity of your neighboring municipalities, okay? And this kappa I theta here, so kappa I here in some sense is it's the slope coefficient. That turns out to be the intercept in the reaction function here. And this game has a unique Nash equilibrium under some simple conditions that Bramoulle, Cranton, and Damour's supply, which are kind of easy to check when we do the econometrics, meaning we can estimate these parameters, these eigenvalues, and this condition is kind of satisfied in anything we've done so far, so that there's a unique Nash equilibrium in this game. Okay, but there's clearly a kind of refraction problem here in the sense of Mansky, and as I said, we're going to use this approach by Bramoulle, Rachel Cranton, and Damour, and other co-authors as a way of sort of getting around this, but there's a slight twist in our problem, in our case, as we're going to show. Okay, so substituting the first order condition, we can rewrite this prosperity equation like this, and it's, so it ends up actually being prosperity in municipality I with respect to prosperity outcome J ends up being a quadratic function of your own kind of SI. So, if I wanted to start singing the praises of structural econometrics, this is where I could do it. But as I said, I'm going to resist that temptation, having spent a career not doing structural econometrics. But those of you who are doing structural econometrics in the audience will be able to legitimately gloat at this point about how if you did something really dumb and, ignored the fact that there was this convex relationship here and ran a naive regression of Pij on SI, you wouldn't be estimating what you're interested in. Particularly, you'd be retrieving theta, this parameter theta at best, which is what which is the marginal cost of providing the state. You're not capturing the parameter you're interested in if you're asking the question, what's the impact in municipality I of increasing its state capacity on some prosperity outcome? Okay, so, all right. So there's a whole bunch of identification problems here. And let me just talk about the data, and then I'll talk about how we address these identification problems, because we're going to be interested in estimating these prosperity equations for different prosperity outcomes, and we're also interested in estimating these best response functions, and there's a lot of endogenous things here, so let me try to explain what the data is and what the approach is, okay? So the data here is we have these prosperity outcomes, we have inputs, state capacity, number of people, number of agencies. We have, well, we're not going to talk about BI. So XI is just other kind of exogenous covariates, which is here mostly going to be geographical stuff. And CI, which is the historical covariates, which is the royal roads, and I'll talk more about that in a second when I explain why the natural approach from Bramoulle et al. Work isn't necessarily very convincing here. Okay, so we have about 1,000 municipalities and blah, blah, blah. So what do we have? Well, we have secondary enrollment is going to be one output. Why don't we have primary enrollment? Well, primary enrollment is something that's determined mostly by the national government. So that's actually nice for us because we can use that as a kind of placebo regression. So we can use, what I'm going to show you, if I have time, is to show you a few regressions where we use other development outcomes at the local level, which are more determined by national agencies, like the vaccination rate, for example. And I'm going to show you that that's uncorrelated with state capacity at the local level, measured the way we're measuring it. So that's kind of nice in this context. Fraction of the population below the poverty line, I was talking about that. Average coverage of public utilities, aqueduct, sewage, and electricity, and this mysterious life quality index that somebody in Colombia constructs, taking into account happiness, and I don't know what else they have in that, but I'm sure there's people here who know more than I do. Okay, so local state capacity, I talked about that. National state capacity, I'm not going to talk about that. And, colonial state data, okay? So what is this colonial state data? Let me talk about the econometrics, and I'll back up and talk about royal roads for a couple of minutes, okay? So we're interested in estimating these equations here, this best response function and this prosperity equation. So these have departmental kind of fixed effects here. So we're going to include departmental fixed effects, and we're going to model this kappa I over theta here as a function of these sort of xi, which are going to be exogenous covariates, and ci, which are these historical covariates like distance to royal roads, which you'll find completely mysterious at the moment, but I promise in a minute or two I'm going to motivate why on earth we're interested in these historical covariates. So I think, this is blah, blah, blah. I think this is, everything we have so far, we're just looking at kind of polynomials. We're just going to approximate this by a polynomial. And there's two kind of strategies, econometric strategies we're going to use. One is we're going to estimate these things separately using instrumental variables, and I have to motivate the identification strategy in a second. And we can also estimate them all simultaneously using system GMM. So J+1 equations, the best response function, and the capital J equations for the different prosperity outcomes, which is just 4 here. So that's like 5. J+1 equals 5. Okay, and that allows us to exploit kind of cross-equation restrictions, which are in the model, as opposed to just estimating these things separately. Okay, so so how do we do this IV? How do we think about this identification problem here? Well, if you just thought about this equation here, you can say, well, I can't estimate this equation here by OLS because there's all these things on the right-hand side are clearly endogenous. So how can I approach this problem? Well, the clever idea in Bramoulle et al. Is to sort of say as follows. So think I'm in municipality I, and I have a set of neighbors. And the neighbors have neighbors. So there's me, there's my neighbors, and the neighbors of my neighbors. So what they point out is that in this model where my state capacity, of course that's not their model, but in terms of this model, where my state capacity depends on the state capacity of my neighbors, and the state capacity of my neighbors depends on the state capacity of the neighbors of my neighbors, the covariates of the neighbors of my neighbors could be instruments for the impact of my neighbor's state capacity on me, okay? So their idea is it's the neighbors of the covariates of the neighbors which can be used as instruments for the state capacity of the neighbor, which is what you have in this equation here, right? So here I have this weighted sum of the state capacity of the neighbors. So their idea would be to say, use these exogenous covariates of the neighbors as instruments for this weighted sum of the state capacity of my neighbors. Okay, so great. So we could implement that, and we have, but we also got worried that, in this context, whether or not that identification strategy is convincing or not is going to depend on the context, and whether or not you think there's going to be unobservables that could be correlated across a bunch of municipalities. So our approach, to worrying about that, so for example, you might imagine that, that departmental fixed effects are not really going to take out all sorts of unobservables that may vary at the subdepartmental level. They may influence a whole bunch of municipalities. And so, something like that could invalidate the identification strategy here. So our idea is to try to sort of use a kind of historical approach and say, well, maybe the covariates of the neighbors is not it doesn't satisfy the exclusion restriction, but if we had some historical determinants of state capacity in Colombia, then we could use, this is the CIs, what we could do was, instead of instrumenting the state, there's this weighted sum of state capacity of my neighbors by the covariates of the neighbors of my neighbors, we could instrument it by the historical state capacity of the neighbors of my neighbors. Now, why is that convincing? So let me go back to royal roads, okay? So what's the point of talking about royal roads? Well, in the colonial period in Colombia, the Spanish created a large system of royal roads, okay? Now, I showed you what one of those roads were like. Those roads were partially constructed on top of indigenous roads. Indigenous roads, were involved lots of steps and like Inca roads, if you've ever seen any of these roads. So it wasn't a road like you might imagine today. But in the colonial period, this road network was used for transportation, it was used for communication, it was used for mules and people walking. But in the 20th century, when Colombia started constructing a modern road system, but that may be, it's not clear they actually have started creating a modern road system, but kind of, modulo that problem. When they, what more modern road system in the 1940s and 1950s, the royal roads were useless for this, because they were built on mountainsides and they were not engineered, they were not in places where it was possible to build a modern road system. So the royal road system was kind of abandoned and a new road system was created. So what's appealing about the royal road system is to sort of say, well, there's persistence in the presence of the state over time. Historically, the proximity to royal roads helped create state presence, it helped create urban centers or whatever, but that's a source of variation in the presence of the state that's kind of disappeared today. So that's an attractive source of variation in the sense that historically it created variation in where the state was, but today the royal road system is kind of completely irrelevant, so it doesn't determine anything, so it seems to be likely that that's kind of excludable in the econometric sense. So we used a whole bunch of other things as well. We didn't just use the royal roads. So we found, so what we did was so here's a royal road now, a major tourist attraction, you can see. We kind of georeferenced the maps of royal roads so we could construct a measure of the distance of the centroid of a municipality to the nearest royal road. And we also used this data from a 1794 census of colonial census of all the colonial officials in what was then New Granada, this is all the state agencies. What were state agencies? What do we have? Well, we have the monopolies for gunpowder and aguardiente and playing cards. We have, people collecting and tobacco. We have different sorts of functionaries. Actually, we have all the Catholic Church as well. I realized recently we didn't use the priests, and somebody said, no, that was mad, because that was the state, the Catholic Church. So we could include, once we include the priests and the church, actually, we'd have a lot more variation in this. So this is just presence of state agencies, mostly these tax and regulatory agents, Casa de Monedas and things like that. And this is just the number of agencies. Of course, the number of people was massively concentrated. There was very high density in a few places like Santa Marta, Cartagena, Bogota, but they were spread out, pretty much over the country. So I think the Royal Roads is a kind of nicer idea, but the idea here is to sort of say, this is where the colonial state was in Colombia, and this is, so if you think that this creates some kind of persistence or path dependence in the location of the state, then you might imagine that, these historical covariates in the neighbor of the neighbor, they help predict, as we'll see, they help predict state presence in the neighbor of the neighbor today. They help predict state presence in my neighbor today, but they're plausibly excludable in the way that the exogenous covariates of the neighbor are in the Bramoulle and Cranton setting. Gosh, okay, sorry, I hope it's not too contrived. I've never presented this before, so it's probably completely incoherent, and my sincere apologies. Okay, so let's get to the. This is just to kind of say, no, let me just try to talk about the estimates, because I want to leave some time for some questions. Okay, so the first thing is, let's look at some estimates of this best response function using different strategies. So just a simple kind of naive OLS IV, where I instrument the state capacity of my neighbors by the historical covariates of the neighbor of my neighbors. Distance to Royal Roads, presence of state functionaries in 1794, and presence of state agencies in 1794. And this is the IV. The difference between 2 and 3 is that we're controlling here for population. So, you could think, well, that's an important covariate that, we're just counting the number of civil servants, right? The number of civil servants, the number of state agencies. You think that's going to depend on population. So we want to control for population, but I guess we're concerned that population is going to be endogenous. So population instrumented means population of the municipality today instrumented by the population of the municipality in the 1843 census, which is the oldest proper data we could get. And this is the system GMM estimates here. Okay, so what do you find here? Well, this is the kind of the marginal effect of the impact of think about this is the best response here, okay? So the dependent variable is your state capacity, and this is the marginal effect of the state capacity of your neighbors on you, kind of evaluated at the mean. So this is positive and significant, and it's pretty robust across different specifications. The first 4 columns is just looking at the log of the number of municipality state agencies. Okay, this is like the number of state agencies, like a count variable, and here's the number of municipal employees. So these four columns are exactly the same. It's just a different way of measuring state capacity. But again, you see robust sort of positive effects of this is just sort of looking at the best response. So looking at how. So this is just sort of showing how your state capacity does depend significantly on the state capacity of your neighbors. So I guess, this is not something, we started thinking about this, we had no idea sort of what the econometrics was going to show when we got into this. So I guess this is one kind of interesting aspect of this. And, what are these variables here? Well, these are just, in municipality I, your own kind of historical covariates, okay? So these are like the colonial covariates, colonial state officials, agencies, and distance to Royal Road, kind of historically. So these are, when you chuck them all in, having them all in is going to be appealing because it allows us to do an over-identification test. If you think of all 3 of them as being separate instruments so there's sort of 3 historical covariates here in the neighbor of your neighbors. So if you thought of those as all being separate instruments for the state capacity of your neighbors. We can look at kind of over-identification tests to check for the validity of instruments, but they're pretty correlated. Okay, so this is the kind of first message, that there seems to be a quite significant effect of neighboring state capacity on your state capacity. Okay, so I'll get to that right at the end. Okay, so what does the first stage look like here? So remember, so if I just thought about the simple IV here, okay, if I thought about the simple IV here, what does the first stage look like? Well, this is what it looks like. So we're instrumenting this weighted sum of the state capacity of your neighbors by these historical neighbors of the neighbors' historical state capacity. Okay, gulp. Okay, so this looks, this looks fairly nice. Okay, so meaning, well, this doesn't look very nice, but this looks nicer. So what does this tell you here? Okay, so this negative significant effect here sort of says, further from royal roads has this negative effect on your state capacity, so kind of more isolated relative to the historical colonial road system. That's in line with the hypothesis, and more historically, more colonial state agencies in the neighbor of your neighbor is positively correlated with the state capacity of your neighbors. Okay, so this is the first stage. The third stage doesn't look weak or whatever, so that's good news. Okay, so that's the kind of the best response equation. Let me talk a little bit about the prosperity equation. Okay, so here let's just look at, like, for example, public utilities coverage. Okay, so now we're looking at different. We're going to do the same thing, which is we're going to look at OLS, IV instrumented, but with population instrumented, and the system GMM, and we're looking at what's the effect of the marginal effect of your own state capacity on that particular prosperity outcome, and then we can also calculate the marginal effect of your neighbor's state capacity, average neighbor's state capacity on your prosperity outcome. And this is where this kind of order of magnitude thing comes in. You can see that this is the own effect, this is the effect of your neighbors, so it's statistically significant, but it's quantitatively much smaller, which I guess is, we find kind of plausible than the own effect. And what does what are we instrumenting in this equation? Well, if I go back to what this looks like here, we're going to be instrumenting. We want to instrument this term here, and we're also going to be instrumenting this term here. So the strategy is very similar. So we're going to instrument this strategy in the same. We're going to instrument this in the same way. At least when we're estimating this kind of one-on-one using IV, we're going to instrument using the historical covariates of the neighbors, and then we just instrument that using the squared term by analogy. So whoops, here we are. Okay. So I guess the bottom line here, subject to the usual caveats of identification, is I should have said, I didn't dwell on this. The fact that this thing is the fact that this thing is positive here is telling us that there's actually strategic complementarities between state capacity. So it's not a case of kind of free riding off your neighbor here. There's complementarities, strategic complementarities, and what this suggests is that there's significant positive effects of state capacity on prosperity, subject to all the caveats about the econometrics. Okay, so we could look at this in, for all lots of different specifications. It's very robust across different things, not in poverty, so more state capacity, fewer people in poverty, more state capacity of your neighbors, fewer people in poverty, more state capacity, fewer secondary enrollment, etc. So there's one, as I said, this placebo regression is kind of interesting, which is, imagine I run the same regression, but instead I put on the left-hand side something like vaccination coverage for the most recent data we have, which is something that's decided at the national state, then you don't find significant positive effects of your own state capacity on that development outcome. So that's some kind of reality check on this. And let me finish by talking, not going to talk about that. Whoops, what happened to this? Yes. Let me talk a little bit about the quantitative effects, and then I'm going to shut up. I'm confused. No, okay. So let me one more minute and then I'll shut up. So what's the quantitative effect of this? Well, there's lots of different exercises you could undertake here to look at this. So one simple exercise is to say, think of the whole distribution of state capacities, and imagine I took everyone below the median and I moved them to the median, but I didn't let anybody else kind of react to that. Okay? So if I'm below the median, but I'm next to a municipality with above median state capacity, then in this exercise, I increase my state capacity to the median, but I don't touch the state capacity of the municipality next to me. Okay? Of course, their prosperity level is going to increase because my state capacity is going to go up, and there's all sorts of interactions, but you're not looking at the whole general equilibrium. So what do you find here? So think of this as this is the partial equilibrium exercise here, and the bottom panel is the general equilibrium exercise when you basically allow everyone to adjust to this, okay? So what's the effect of this? Well, you could say this is a huge increase, right? I mean, if you actually took the state capacity of the municipalities below median in Colombia and improved them to the median, I don't think even President Uribe managed to get close to that, then this is a massive change. So you could say, like, okay, hold on, the quantitative effects are large, but actually the change is massive too. So the policy, the experiment is massive too. But what you see in that partial equilibrium effect is, well, you see some changes in quality of life. Poverty falls a little bit, secondary enrollment goes up a little bit, but when you introduce the general equilibrium effects, it goes up enormously quantitatively. So when you allow everyone to kind of re-optimize, then you find much larger falls in poverty and very large increases in secondary school enrollment, big increases in utility coverage. So there's lots of bits and pieces and moving parts here, and I guess we got very focused on this disaggregated approach and trying to think about the technical issues that generated and getting to a kind of convincing way of identifying this effect. And there's more stuff that I'm interested, which is not in the model than is in it, but maybe that's always true. So anyway, I'll shut up now. I'm sure people have questions.
Thank you, James. It's a little bit late, but we have time for 2 or 3 questions. There is any question?
So I'm not an expert on this, but the whole story you're telling is basically thinking of an externality stories that's hard to estimate because of reflection issues, right? My basic intuition when there's a reflection problem is that if you run a regression by OLS, your coefficient will be biased upwards. And your best response regression when you instrument after you instrument, the coefficient actually goes up. So to some extent, I'm not really understanding how that fits. Like the fact that the coefficient for that best response function is going up after you instrument, I don't know how that fits into the theory.
I don't know, I don't know, I mean, it's very common when you do IV that the coefficient goes up, isn't it? I mean, you think here there must be a huge amount of measurement error in what you're interested in kind of everything. So I guess I've just been thinking about that. I mean, I don't know if there's some deeper issue, but I guess I've just thought about that in terms of, well, there's a lot of measurement error here. So if the identification strategy is right, then you might, and it's classical measurement error, then it's not kind of completely unsurprising that the coefficient goes up. But I don't know if there's some deeper problem here that I hadn't thought of. That's how I've been thinking about it.
Another question?
Minor comment regarding the placebo regressions. I'm just worried that since this is education and vaccination, which truly are at the national level, but there might be less variation because, say, in primary education, there's near universal variation. So I guess it would be good to check one thing, such as the police thing that you mentioned, where there are national level issues, but there's also a huge amount of variation. To see if there's not
so that's why I didn't emphasize that primary regression. There's very little variation. There's very little variation in primary school enrollment. So the fact that that's kind of setting it up, that's a very that's a nice thing for us, because there's very little, so you're bound to pass that. But vaccination, I don't remember what the numbers are off the top of my head, the descriptive statistics, but there's much more variation in vaccination coverage than there is in primary education. But any other, other ideas about, we should think about other things that we could use that
Maybe
might
the
be more
police presence that you
convincing.
mentioned.
Yeah.
One more question?
My question is related to that, because I think that the distinction between responsibilities at the national and subnational level is something rather arbitrary. Basically because decentralization is a relatively recent process, and some of the variables that you have are accumulation over long periods. If you take the case of utilities, well, utilities were basically run by the national government through what they call entidades descentralizadas, which were not really decentralized because they were dependent on the central government. It was only maybe in the late 90s or something like that that the actual provision was, probably not the late 90s, but the late 80s, sorry, that they were really transferred the responsibility to the local authorities. So, and if you take any service that you take, you always have a way of a sort of co-responsibility in Colombia, which is part of the decentralization probably in Colombia. So I'm not very sure about the distinction between national and subnational responsibilities.
Yeah, so there's certainly been a lot more decentralization in Colombia since the 1991 Constitution. So I guess a very tough test for us would be to try to estimate these regressions using stuff in the 1980s. So using the same sorts of dependent variables looking before the decentralization. So I think if the results are, I agree, so that for the non-Colombians in the audience, yes, there's been an awful lot of change in this. So looking at the contemporary data, so we're going to try to work on that. I think that's a very tough test. So if we find that, if we go back to the 1980s, we find very different things, which I think is plausible because there's much less decentralized control over things, then I think that will make this much stronger, yeah.
We have time for just one more question.
So given the way you started the talk and now that you have this framework and also given your previous work, you said that one of the ideas of the state was also like a monopoly on violence. So given that you already have that, it could be interesting also to look at violence outcomes, because many of the things of state capacity were sure delivery of public goods, but in the Colombian context also state monopoly of violence, and of course we had a lot of variation in violence, unfortunately. So it could be interesting to look at that.
Yeah, I totally agree that we're heading in that direction. But Daron has this, some of his ex-students in the audience will know, he has very strong views on like what are interesting dependent variables for economists and what are not interesting dependent variables for economists. So he dictated we have to specialize, we have to start by focusing on the dependent variables which are interesting for economists, and that's not one of them apparently.
James, thank you very much. We have a dinner.